Bom, bom dia a todos. Vamos dar início aos nossos trabalhos, até porque temos um horário um pouco restrito aqui na congregação, que hoje temos a reunião da congregação à tarde, e antes da congregação ainda tem uma reunião de outro órgão da faculdade, que é o CTA, então temos que ser rigorosos aqui com relação ao nosso horário. Eu só vou fazer uma apresentação, a apresentação do professor será feita pelo João Costa Neto, mas eu queria, antes de mais nada, abrir os trabalhos, aliás, fazer isso no começo é importante, ressaltando a relevância da vinda do professor aqui para o Largo de São Francisco. Talvez vocês não conheçam, por nome esse professor, mas saibam que ele tem uma importância enorme no ambiente europeu e, em especial, do direito privado, do estudo de direito privado, direito civil, no contexto europeu. Vocês vão perceber isso pelo breve currículo dele, que será exposto pelo professor João Costa Neto. Agora, já ressalto que também o currículo dele falará por si só, mas um aspecto interessante da carreira acadêmica do professor é que ele tem se dedicado nos últimos anos a um estudo específico do direito latino-americano. É um enfoque diferente daquele que alguns viram com um professor que esteve aqui, ordinário da Universidade de Roma, há alguns meses atrás, que os trabalhos foram presididos pelo professor Mark. Eles têm visões diferentes desse conjunto que alguns chamam de direito latino-americano. E essa visão diferente dele é uma visão. Hoje falam muito em decolonization, descolonialização, seria isso em português? Acho que é isso, né? Do, do, do direito. Eles têm uma linha de pesquisa muito interessante no Instituto Max Planck, que é bem diferente da italiana, e é algo que nós, como latino-americanos, mas principalmente como brasileiros, nós temos que conhecer. O professor, ele assumiu a diretoria do Max Planck de Direito Comparado, Direito Privado Comparado, um pouquinho antes do início da pandemia, mas seja lá como for, já está no cargo já há uns bons, eu acredito que uns 5 anos aproximadamente. Então, é um enorme prazer, é um professor não só vão ver, ele tem formação em Cambridge, professor pesquisador na Alemanha, então que já faz com que ele circule muito bem entre Common Law, Civil Law, que já é o único, mas com esse adendo. É um professor de comparado que conhece Civil Law, Common Law, vive os dois, mas também que conhece um pouco do que seria o nosso sistema jurídico. Não por acaso também ele vem aqui ao Largo São Francisco, podemos falar isso, é a principal faculdade em língua portuguesa do mundo também, então acaba sendo interessante também para ele nesse aspecto. Então é um enorme prazer receber o professor aqui conosco. Guardem esse momento que provavelmente se não conheciam o nome dele, o João dará mais detalhes, certamente vão ver falar muito do nome dele nos próximos anos. E vejam, eu passei para os monitores repassarem para vocês a página do Max Planck, que tem as principais publicações dele. Depois vejam, muitas delas estão disponíveis online. Vale muito a pena ter alguns artigos. Depois eu posso selecionar para vocês que vale muito a pena a leitura e a maioria deles não em língua alemã, o que evidentemente em língua inglesa, o que facilita muito a tarefa para vocês, tá bom? Então passo a palavra para o João para ele fazer uma apresentação mais detalhada, um currículo breve do professor.
E antes de passar para o inglês, até por causa do nosso convidado, eu preciso só registrar a alegria de estar aqui, agradecer muito a todos pela presença, em especial ao professor Bernardo de Moraes, sem o qual esse evento não aconteceria. Realmente a gratidão é imensa e essa parceria entre a Universidade de Brasília e a USP tem sido muito feliz. Já estamos no nosso terceiro evento com convidados internacionais de ponta. So Professor Ralf Michels or Rolf Michaels, if you either pronounce it as in German or in English, is the director at the Institute, Max Planck Institute for Private International Law. It is one of the most prestigious institutes in the world. It is renowned for its vast library. It's probably the second largest library in private law worldwide, and it is probably the best one for us civil lawyers from the Roman law tradition. I think the first one is Harvard Law, but certainly the Max Planck has the best books in Italian law, but also Brazilian law. It is really, I would suggest that any of you, if you have the chance to visit the Institute and see the great, rare books, sometimes Brazilian law books that we can't even find here, but we can find them there. And the Institute will celebrate its 100th anniversary in 2026. It's going to be a big celebration, very special thing. And for 100 years, they have preserved many of the most rare books from private law, either from Portugal, South Africa, China, Japan, you name it. And it's really a pleasure to have one of its directors here, a very renowned professor who has studied not only in Germany, but also in Cambridge in the UK, and for a number of years held a directorship at Duke University in the US. So I think Ralf will show you how interdisciplinary his approach to private theory is. And he's one of the most distinguished scholars in the subject today, and it's an honor to have him here. You have the floor.
Muito obrigado. Thank you, Nero. Thank you, Joao. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I apologize, I will have to speak in English. I will try to be slow, and sometimes I become faster, and then you can just make loud sounds, and then I get slower again. And I rightly said, one of our projects in Hamburg at the Institute is at the moment decolonization, decolonial comparative law. In fact, right from here tomorrow morning, I will go to Brasilia, where we are running a workshop on comparative property law, decolonial comparative property law, and then on to Bahia for a spring school in decolonial comparative law. So that will be a whole week full of decolonial law. And there will be very little of that today, but maybe you can spot it. There is a bit of decolonial thought in the middle of the presentation. And if there is a quiz afterwards, then you will know what to say on that. The topic today that I speak about is a very theoretical one, and it's a very broad one, and I hope I can fit everything I want to say in the 40 minutes. We will see. The topic that I speak about is towards sustainable private law theory. And you can see instantly this is a double entendre, a double meaning. This is a theory of sustainable private law. That is a quest to make private law sustainable. But it is also the attempt to develop a theory that itself is sustainable in the sense of both legitimacy and the ability to pertain. Now, the challenge, of course, from sustainability is clear to all of you. I do not have to talk about it much. This is just one of the many shocking graphs that we know about. This is the North Atlantic sea surface temperature anomaly from last year, where we see that the oceans are heating up, and we know lots of other developments in the world that look very bad because they are not constant, because there is a decline, there is a tendency in the climate crisis and other events towards great perils, possibly destructions. And of course, our response is some kind of sustainability. And often when we discuss sustainability and law, we do so in the realm of public international law or constitutional law, or maybe administrative law, environmental law. And we don't look enough at private law. But of course, the extraction to the world, the causes of the climate crisis lie very much in private law institutes. Extraction of the Amazon, to take an example from Brazil, rests on property rights, on contract rights, on the insufficiency of tort, on the insufficiency of unjust enrichment. So all of those are private law transactions that lead to the decline of the Amazon, and this is true more generally, I think. This is just a map of the enormity of trade. It's a strange map I saw preparing for this, because in this map, Latin America has almost no trade, so I don't trust the map. But in general, it is meant to suggest that a lot of what contributes to our problems today rests in private law. And it is for that reason that private law is one core area we need to look at in order to achieve sustainability. That is what I want to do today with you. My 3 theses are simple and straightforward. The first, private law is unsustainable because it creates negative externalities. Second, usually in such situations when private law is ineffective, we go to public law to clean up after private law, so to speak. Public law is no solution, I say here, because public law does not capture these externalities. And so the third thesis is we need a sustainable private law, but that requires nothing less than a paradigm shift. And I'll try to convince you of all 3 of these theses. And I want to do so first by talking briefly about what I mean by modern private law, which I see as different from Roman private law in important aspects. I want to introduce how sustainability presents a challenge to that modern private law. I then want to introduce 3 types of externalities that private law creates: global south externalities, nature externalities, future externalities. And I then want to sketch, really nothing more than sketch, how private law can be responsive. Now, when I say modern private law is different from Roman law, I mean not that the institutions of private law are different, because the doctrines of private law very much emerge in the European continental tradition, in Roman law, property, contract, tort, less so perhaps private international law, and certainly there is lots of change from Roman law to our contemporary times. But when I say modern private law is different from Roman law, this is not so much in the form, but in the function. The functions of private law with the industrialization become different from those that we had before. Private law becomes an instrument towards growth. Private law becomes an instrument towards freedom. And private law, thirdly, is analyzed as creating, in theory, almost no externalities. Let me explain all 3 of those very briefly. First, private law is meant from the 18th and more so 19th century on as an instrument for growth, for economic growth. Contracts are no longer needed merely for subsistence, but for expansion, for the creation of capital, for the extraction of resources, for the improvement of living standards, etc. And so, from this moment on, at least contract and property become instruments towards extraction and creative destruction, to use the term from Schumpeter, as something intrinsic to capitalism. That is, we extract resources, we also produce waste on the other side, And we constantly destroy what we have in order to build something better. So there's nothing sustainable in that. Creative destruction, if you think about it, is the opposite of sustainability. We tear down the taxi industry and replace it with Uber. We tear down the hotel industry, replace it with Airbnb. We tear down the book industry and replace it with online services, et cetera, et cetera. This is intrinsic to capitalist development. And all of this is done through private law, through contracts, through property, to some extent tort and unjust enrichment. Second, private law becomes about freedom more so than it was before. Freedom in this sense, not only in the negative sense of being free from interference from others, but also freedom in a positive sense as an ability to maximize one's own interests. You can see that kind of image that comes at us from the Enlightenment and is then put into practice in 19th century private law tends to lose communal values, at least in the first step, because everyone is supposed to follow their own interests. If you take Adam Smith's famous dictum that the baker bakes not because he wants to be good to everyone, he wants to give everyone bread. The baker bakes bread because that's how he makes money. And so there's an individual interest of freedom at the basis of contract and property. And so if we fear then that this leads to pure individualism and expansion, the third element that we hope for, at least in private law, is that it almost creates no externalities. That is, private law is private in the sense that both the rights it creates and the consequences it creates remain within or between the parties. A contract, in theory, has no effect on third parties. Or if it does, it has beneficial effects on third parties, but no negative effects on parties. Such negative effects would be negative externalities. Externalities, broadly speaking, as third-party effects or effects outside of the transaction that we look at. Property, in principle, should be a right of the owner. You can trade freely, obviously, but the property itself does not create negative externalities for third persons. Or indeed, if it does, then you are net liable. If you have a piece of land and you have a factory on it and the factory creates pollution, then you're liable for that pollution. So in theory, private law, on the one hand, aims at growth, and on the other hand, has almost no externalities. And then the question, of course, arises, how is that possible? Let's see one example. Let's see property. Property defined as a space of freedom for Hegel. So here we have this individualization. From the perspective of externalities, one of the justifications for property is that the owner internalizes the costs of the use of their property. So many of you may have heard this already. This is standard. And for example, the economic analysis of law is an example that is called the tragedy of the commons. Take a forest. A forest with a number of people who want to have wood. If everyone is free to cut as many trees as they want, the forest will likely disappear. Everyone will take as many trees as are good for them and does not care about everyone else. It would be rational if everyone were to limit cutting trees, but no individual has an interest to do so. Every individual has an interest in getting as many trees as they can from this forest, because every additional tree that I cut is going to benefit me entirely. And every tree that I leave there, the leaving it there benefits me only a little because it benefits everyone else in the community. And so for me individually, there's an interest in cutting down as many trees as possible. And that's true for everyone. And so we have what is called the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons in the sense that this is a commons, this is commonly owned, this forest. And the tragedy is that it will probably then disappear. There's some critique of this. It is probably historically untrue. It is also logically not necessary, but this is a very strong idea at the time. Now, the response to that, the typical response to that, is individual ownership. Everybody gets a piece of the forest, and now everybody has an interest to cut down no more trees than are, or leave as many trees as are necessary to keep the forest, to maintain the forest in continuation. Because I'm not taking everybody's trees, the trees that I'm cutting down cut directly into my own wealth. And that is one big justification for individual ownership, the internalization of the costs of my conduct. The benefit of my conduct is I get the trees. The cost of my conduct is the tree is gone, and maybe the forest dies, and I have to bear these costs. This is my forest. So every tree lost is directly going to cost 100% only me. And that's why the hope is that individual ownership is actually good for sustainability. In fact, it is in forestry that the notion of sustainability was first developed. In the 18th century, the thought about how can forests be maintained? What is the optimal level of cutting down trees? Second example here, contract. Contract is about freedom. It is about individual decisions on who to contract with, where to get the goods that I need, how much to ask for them. It is also effective because it is in contracts, in decentralized knowledge, that we can find out what people want. The state does not know very well what everybody needs, but individual consumers know very well, and they contract for it, and that creates a high level of knowledge, information, far more than the state could generate in other ways. Now, contract also, in principle, is supposed to have no negative externalities. Contract is, in fact, good because it allocates goods to people who value them more, and because, in principle, it creates no third-party externalities. So imagine I have cut down my trees in the forest, but I don't really need that much wood for myself. And so I sell the wood to someone else who values it better, who has a better use for it. I could only burn it perhaps in my stove, and the other person can make something much more effective with it. And that's why that other person values the wood more. And I get money instead, or I get food instead, or something else. So there's also something promising for contract with regard to sustainability, because it makes sense that there is no waste. I don't have to throw away the wood that I have, that I don't need. I can sell it to someone else who can use it. And so in principle, contract should also be good for sustainability. And then let me jump over toward, because otherwise we won't get through here. Now, what's the problem here? How can we have growth without externalities? How should that be possible? If indeed private law institutions were as I described them and did not create externalities, that is, would not use up more resources than they generate, then private law should be sustainable, and yet we see that it is not sustainable. And so why is that? One possibility is it's just not as good enough yet. We could make yet more efficient use of property. We could have yet better allocation through contracts, etc. But the other is that we are lying to ourselves when we say that contract and property have no externalities. We're lying to ourselves because in reality they do have such externalities. I call them tacit here because we don't realize them, but that is possibly where the problem lies. So if we look at from private law to sustainability, an idea, what is it that we look for in sustainability? Sustainability, defined here in the Brundtland report as sustainable development, is that which meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So there's a combination you can see there between needs on the one hand, the essential needs that everybody has with a particular focus on the poor in the world, and the idea that there has to be limitations to the fulfillment of those needs in favor of some others, here future generations, but it is also nature and it is global justice. So there's a tension there, obviously, between sustainability on the one hand, which is permanent, and capitalism, which is about growth. And therefore, there's also a tension between sustainability and development, which is one reason why I think that the notion of sustainable development is a problematic concept. How do we deal with that sometimes? We say private law has no liability, has no responsibility for sustainability. We do that in public law. In private law, we can all grow and expand and fulfill our needs and fly around the world and pollute the world, etc. And public law somehow sets the limits on that. That is how the public-private distinction has, in fact, worked for a long time. Private law allows freedom, freedom of contract, free use of your property, and public law restricts that. Consumer protection, limitations on the use of property, etc. The problem is that that does not work when something third comes in. I'll introduce that later, so I'll jump over it here. This notion of private versus public, or individual interests versus public interests, works only insofar as I can be sure that the public represents everything that matters. It's a classical tension between individual interests and public interests. And we think that individual is just selfish individuals and public is everyone and everything. But in reality, it's not. So we can see three types of externalities that are often not captured. Three types of interests, in other words, that are not captured in this notion of the public, where public law, therefore, is not sufficient to remedy the non-sustainability of private law. The first is what I call global South externalities. We had for a long time, of course, in colonization, explicit structure of extraction of resources from the South to the North, an abuse of cheap labor, and the sending back of waste to the global South. And we have disproportionate effects of climate change on the global South. And so we can see private law does not achieve sustainability in this context, in the North-South relation. So the global justice part of sustainability is not reached. Although, and it's not reached through public law. I'll go in more detail in a moment. Second such externality is nature. And here the same happens, of course. We have an extraction of resources on the one hand, burning down the Amazon, for example, an abuse of the environment. And on the other hand, we create waste. That is, we destroy nature, not only by extracting, but also by dumping waste. And then the third is here, future externalities, where we live off future generations' interests, so to speak. That is, we use up so many of the resources today that future generations will no longer have enough of those. Now you can see already that the public does not include all of these three externalities. And in that sense, it is that public law is not a remedy to these private law problems. Let me show that in some more detail. Property as an individual ownership is the right of extraction. If I own a forest, I can burn it down. If I own a piece of the Amazon, I do in fact often burn it down. We have a lot of that. Contract is not only the win-win situation that we think of normally. I give you my trees, you give me a pig or something for me to eat, and we each are better off. But the win-win, the gain between the contract parties comes at the expense of something outside of that. Think back of the forest example. Forest ownership allows me to burn down my forest, which is not sustainability. Contracts over wood, over forest wood, allow parties to make a profit from that wood at the expense of the forest. So there's a win-win between the seller of the wood and the buyer of the wood. But that win comes at the expense of the forest and of nature more generally. Again, as I said, I'm leaving out tort here for time, for purposes of time. And that is why typically the response is public law, and here public law response is not sufficient. Here's a simple juxtaposition, if you want, of private law and public law. Private law, we said, is about freedom. It's about the market. It's about growth and efficiency. And public law, in turn, is about equality. It's about a welfare state and some justice there. It's about compensation and equity. And so we could think it's not so problematic if private law creates all these problems, because public law will come in and limit them or even remedy them. In the end, then, we'd have a simple juxtaposition between private autonomy in the private law sense. People can do what they want, and restrictions from public law on what they do. We can, of course, translate some of those concerns into private law. We then have something that we call regulatory private law. We use private law for public purposes. Climate change litigation is one example. A farmer in Colombia sues a big oil company in Germany for their contributions to the climate crisis. So we have a private law claim, a tort claim in that case, for public purposes, enforcing public law values. So this dualism is not necessary. Private law can do some of these functions of public law. But my question here is, are these functions themselves enough? And the suggestion is not. I'll show you why in the context of these three externalities I mentioned first. Global South externalities. We say colonialism is explicit extraction. Neocolonialism is an implicit extraction. There's a study that says that the transfer of wealth from South to North between 1960 and 2018 amounts to $62 trillion, or 152 trillion when accounting for lost growth, which is a little accounting tricking. I think the 62 number is more plausible. There's still a stunning number of wealth that moves, in fact, from that part of the world which is already poorer to that part of the world that is already richer. There are other ways of accounting for this as well. Now, normally we would say that shouldn't happen. If private law creates these inequalities, think of consumer contracts, we remedy that. We respond to that. We protect the consumer. We make sure that the consumer does not overpay. Why does this not happen in the global spectrum? Largely for two reasons. One, most of the relevant law is national law. And that means states in the global north will protect their own public, but will not protect the public in the south. And especially will not protect the public in the south at the expense of the public in the north. Because they may say it's all good and well to protect workers in Bangladesh, but not if it hurts workers in Germany. And so the laws that they make are territorially confined. European laws on consumer protection, worker protection, etc., apply as such to Europeans. And in fact, Europe benefits. Now we have a bit of a response, but Europe benefits from the fact that labor is much cheaper in the rest of the world. In part, labor is much cheaper in the rest of the world because working conditions are much worse. It's not part of it, of course. So that is one reason why public law cannot sufficiently respond. It is territorially limited. And the second reason, of course, is that states in the global south have an interest in attracting capital, in attracting investment, and for that reason have an interest in keeping labor cheap. If they made labor expensive, they would no longer be able to trade. They would lose their competitive advantage, or even their comparative advantage at times. And so there's a second reason, there's a reason why countries in the global north do not extend this protection. And there's a reason why states in the global south do not extend this, this protection. So Brazil could say, we do not go through austerity because austerity is bad for the poor. We're going to have a big welfare program, even if we run up big debts. And then the global financial market will say, we punish you for that. We find, therefore, we talked about this, we find the Brazilian currency less attractive, we find investing in Brazil less attractive. And so even a country as powerful as Brazil, as big as Brazil, is forced to lower its protection. So there's a first simple example, if you want, where public law cannot remedy the unsustainability of private law. And you can see why, because the public defined in public law is a national public and is not a global public. It includes everyone, but it includes everyone only within one state, not truly everyone in the world. We can go out from that further when we look at the second example of externalities, nature externalities. This is a well-known way to try and depict what sustainability means, what it aims at. You can see here 3 circles: the economic, that is the profit; the social, that is the people; and the environment, that is the planet. Where economic and social are both met, we find solutions that we call equitable. That's what you see on the right. Where the social and the environmental match, that's what we call acceptable. Where the economic and the environment match, that is viable, and only when all 3 match do we truly gain sustainability. This is a sustainability, obviously, that contains both social values and nature values. Now, what do we talk about when we talk about the relation between private law and public law? We talk essentially about the relation between the red circle and the blue circle. We talk about finding a balance between the individual economic profit and the social, the people. And so that solution then becomes equitable. But if it's equitable, it is not sufficient because it does not account for the interests of nature. And in fact, there's a chance, for a long time there was such a chance, that such a compromise is even worse for nature. As long as I let the poor starve in my country, I don't have to do a lot of extraction. But when I want to make sure that I feed an 80 million population, I have to have very extensive farming. I have to put a lot of toxic things into the soil, etc. So in order to bring about that individual interests and social interests are met, nature may be sacrificed. And so there you can see that this two-way image is not sufficient. The contrast between freedom and equality, between market economy and welfare state, between growth and compensation is not sufficient. We need a third element to that. In addition to freedom and equality, we need compatibility with interests of nature. Instead of juxtaposing the market economy and the welfare state, we have to bring nature into that frame. And beyond growth and efficiency and compensation and equity between people, we need the viability of nature as the very foundation on which all of the others are possible. And what does that mean when we translate that into law? We have to in some way move beyond private law and public law. And we have to have a third category that I'm not sure how to name. Here I name it environmental law. Probably nature law would be a better term. That would go beyond private autonomy and restrictions and come back to an idea of stewardship. What do I mean by stewardship? I'll come to that in the end again. Essentially the idea that a property owner has not only rights, but also obligations. And one of those obligations is to maintain their property. But you can see that is not a genuine public law concern. The public law concern would say, and sometimes does, we have to protect the environment. You cannot just go out and pollute because the environment is there for everyone. But this is still an anthropocentric perspective that protects the environment only because and insofar as it benefits humans. And it does not, therefore, truly account for this third circle that I had, that is nature with its own rights. Now, we could, of course, perhaps translate all of these nature interests or environmental interests into interests of the population, but it would only be the interests of the current population. Current population votes, and possibly votes for environmental protection, but as we can see, positively does not vote for legislation that is strong enough to really maintain nature. We have a backtrack in that, a backlash in that. And so future generations do not occur. We live at the cost of future generations. Now we know, and I'll say this briefly, there are planetary boundaries. This is one of the well-known studies to say there are certain points of no return on a number of issues here. Climate change, integrity of the biosphere, freshwater use, etc. We can go and use this up, but at some point we can no longer go back. In the same way in which if you boil an egg, at the end the egg is hard. You cannot turn the egg back into soft. One idea in sustainability is, of course, we overuse today because in the future we hope we can underuse and can get this back somehow. And the idea of transplanetary boundaries says there's a limit to that. At some point you can no longer do that. And so, in fact, this translates into the most pressing of these externality problems. That is, there are no actual externalities. Everything that we take away in terms of resources is taken away at that moment. Everything that we waste is wasted at that moment. We can only regrow based on what is already there. There is no outside resource that we can get this from. The development of capitalism, of course, has always been extraction of something that lies outside of society. Extraction from the global south that lies outside of European society. Extraction of nature, which lies outside of society. Extraction from the future or living at the expense of the future, which is not within current society. And planetary boundaries suggest to us there is no such outside. Nothing is outside. We are all in one world with this together. What does that mean for private law, of course? It means that even the third element that I put in before, nature, alone does not suffice because we have to put the future in as well. So I gave you, for a long time, a lot of problems, and I can only sketch and very briefly possible solutions. And the reason is I'm not at all sure what the solutions should be, and more importantly, how viable they could be. But here are the responses that I would have. We say we can create sustainability in private law either through more efficient use of property, by avoiding waste, through perhaps the circular economy, or by using these tacit externalities. We saw we cannot use tacit externalities anymore. Externalities are ruled out. The only thing that we have in terms of private law to rest on is the institutions of private law themselves. And that means that is where the paradigm shift comes in. That is where the question comes, can we rethink what private law is for and what it's about? I would say possibly because we have done that before. I suggested in the 19th century that is what happened. Private law became something other than what it had been before. It became this law of growth and freedom and no externalities. And the paradigm shift that would be needed now would take away all of these three elements. It would replace individual freedom with responsibility. It would replace growth with sustenance. And it would replace the linear thinking from extraction to waste with circularity, possibly with a circular economy, where what it would otherwise be waste is again turned into a resource. Take the fashion industry, on which I'm doing some research at the moment. There's huge environmental damage at the beginning of making clothes, in labor, in nature, in all kinds of parts. Then these clothes are worn for very few days because they're very cheap, and then they are dumped somewhere in these huge dumping grounds. And so this is linear and is unsustainable. And a circular model would mean that what seems to be waste in the end is then turned again into a resource. But those are paradigmatic shifts, as you can see, because it's not by coincidence that private law became about growth and individual freedom and waste. It is in the very element of the particular idea of capitalist expansion that developed in the 19th century. What would that mean for private law in relation to public law? Normally, the limitations would be in public law, as I said before. But that is only one step, as we saw, because public law can only account for the interests of the community, and that community is typically a local community. So in addition to that, we need to mobilize private law towards these public interests. So if you take the climate change litigation, that is often transnational litigation. The example I named was a Colombian farmer suing a German company in German court. And so it's interestingly private international law that can help overcome these territorial boundaries here. The German state could not regulate in Colombia. The United Nations could not and would not want to regulate in Colombia. But the farmer may be able to force a German company to account for interests in Colombia. And then the third, where regulatory is also not sufficient, would be what I call regulatory regenerative private law. That is a rethinking of private law institutions themselves from beyond enforcing individual freedom, beyond public interest of restricting that, towards actively using the private law institutions towards sustainability. I said in the beginning that these private law institutions have the potential of doing that. Property is about the internalization of costs and therefore making sure sustainability. Remember the ownership in the forest. Contract is about optimal allocation of goods, making sure even waste is turned into money. So the potential would be there, and that is where the regenerative potential, at least, of private law institutions could come from. Property rights would become stewardship. That is, the property owner, the owner of the forest, has a right of extraction, but limited by the duty to hold the property in the name of the entire world. Every owner is a steward for the entire world. The land that you hold also in the interest of society. The car that you own, you hold in the interest of the world in its entirety. Contract law would have to become from bilateral and from networks of contracts towards circular models, because there is now outside of the economy. And so we have to think about contract webs that have no beginning points and no end points in order to make sure that what happens in fact, that is that resources and waste stays within the Earth system, is also accounted for through contract. And tort has to become maintenance and regeneration law. And as I said before, I will leave out tort to save time. So that in essence is my suggestion about the paradigm shift, the necessary shift in private law. Private law is a problem. Public law is not a sufficient solution. And so private law has to be reinvented. This is obviously not deep enough to make the case that that should happen or why it should happen, but at least it suggests that this is a way on which to think. It's a way on which I think, and maybe it inspires one or the other of you to think along those ways with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ralf, for your wonderful lecture. Very thought-provoking. We will now take questions from the audience. Would you like to ask anything? Please feel free to do so. Yes, please.
Thank you. All really excellent questions. I would say on the first question, is a market economy compatible with sustainability? I would say yes, potentially yes. What we often do is we conflate market economies with capitalism. Capitalism, probably at least in the way in which we know it, is problematic for sustainability because of the particular, you can read that in Marx already, the desire of capital to always grow and grow and grow. But that's not intrinsic to markets. We've had markets long before we had capitalism. And when I talk about property and contract as potential elements of sustainable private law, that is within, in the broadest sense, a market economy. Now, the paradigm shift that would be needed, obviously, is to avoid the creation of externalities. In the 19th century, from the 19th century on, the tacit externalities were almost a goal of private law, I would say. But of course, before already, private law had no way to protect against those. And so it's not intrinsic in the market to care for that. We would need more for that. That is also one reason why I don't think that carbon credit, which is a market solution, is going to be sufficient. In theory, carbon credits, I suppose everyone knows what is meant by that, that you basically, you have rights to pollute up to a certain point, but those are costly. And if you want to pollute more, you can buy those rights from someone else who doesn't want to pollute so much. One problem with these is that they're underpriced. They would have to be, I think, 10 times as expensive or something like that. And so they're not a true market solution. They're really a subsidized market solution, and the subsidy here is a problem. There were a good attempt to say we try to internalize costs. Pollution costs are normally free. No one has to, I mean, you just pollute and you don't have to pay for that. And here you have to pay for that a little. In that sense, it's a good direction, but I would say it is insufficient. And I think market solutions alone will not be sufficient to internalize all of these externalities because they tend to be used towards expansion. So what is needed then, and that's your second question, you said, is this possible without a revolution? It requires, if I'm right, it requires a revolution, at least in thought, in seeing what is possible. I don't even think that an actual kind of revolution would be useful towards this, because the ones doing the revolution would not be nature and would not be future generations. So they would do that for their own interests. But we have these, I looked at sustainable consumer law once, right? And European sustainable consumer law says we have to inform the consumers about all the environmental damages to make sure that they will enforce this. And when you look at it, of course, the consumers have no interest in doing that either. The corporations have no interest in protecting the environment because that is costly to them. But consumers also have no interest in protecting the environment because it's also costly to them. And so revolutionaries will likely care for some things, but not for others. That's a little too pessimistic. There are attempts to say, once I start caring for the common, then I can expand that common. That's the problem there. But what I think is also lacking is, and maybe as a professor I have to say that, is the intellectual realization where the problems lie, and the intellectual realization what kind of conceptual rethinking would be necessary to overcome that. I think that would have to come before any change, and whether and how such change could then come about, I'm not at all sure. But I think without that first step, it's not even clear what should be done. I hope that's responsive to all your three questions. Thank you for those. Excellent questions.
Thank you. Next question. Metlach, please.
So I have to give you special thanks for this question for at least two reasons. First, because you remind me of my doctoral dissertation that I wrote so long ago that I don't know if it links at all to what I'm doing now. But you suggest it does, and so I should maybe go back and see what I wrote 25 years ago. And second, for your mentioning amphitheosis, it's very interesting because at the conference that I'm going to from here in Brasilia, at the workshop, which is on comparative decolonial property law, an Italian scholar, Francesco Iularo, will speak on precisely that. She'll speak on amphitheosis, also as a colonial extraction mechanism. but also as a way in which some kind of sustainability was for some time built into the law, the duty to preserve the ownership that you have. In the history, this is closely related to direct and indirect property, and the person who holds the property holds it to some extent for someone else and has to preserve it. I would think more generally, the institutes that we have can be rethought. That has been done in the past, and it can be done again. And it might be the easier way to bring about the necessary change, but they would have to be rethought then. Others, of course, say, no, it is in fact Western law, European law that has brought about, with its institutions, has brought about the problems that we have. The idea of absolute ownership, right? Ownership as the right to use, to dispose of, to keep others off, would be an intrinsic problem. And so we'd have to get rid of individual ownership altogether and possibly, for example, look at indigenous normative systems that are more aimed at preservation. I'm a little ambivalent on that. So a German court 2 weeks ago was the first court to introduce rights of nature into German law. And many celebrate that as a reverse transplant, as some indigenous knowledge into Northern law. Pachamama, buen vivir. But of course, rights of nature are in many ways a European construct. They're subjective rights. The subjective right is an invention of European law. It comes together with the individualism that lies at the root of some of these problems. And so this is just an expansion of who can hold such rights. And so optimistically, you might say this is a way to rethink European concepts like subjective rights in ways to create sustainability. But in a pessimistic way, you could say this shows the inability of the world to truly account for that which is promising about these indigenous concepts, unity between humans and nature. It's the opposite of a subjective right. Subjective right is subjective, which means it's a right that you have against others. It puts a distance between the rights holder and the rest. And so it may undermine the very essence of where that would be promising. I would think the question is very, very broad and general, and probably can't benefit from general answers. But I would think there is potential also in the European concepts of private law. And because they're not essentially about what they became in the 19th century. I think what they became in the 19th century is a problem, but that is not essential to them as institutions.
Thank you so much. Last question over there before we wrap up. Do you want to speak here? Yes.
Yes. I probably lack the expertise, but I'll give you some uninformed answers. The first, of course, AI is a huge problem for sustainability because it uses up enormous amounts of energy and thereby enormous amounts of resources. That is a problem of AI that we're not discussing enough, but countries are talking about going back to building nuclear reactors just in order to fund AI. So that's one problem. The second danger that I would see in AI is that much of it tends to be conservative in the sense that it rests on the knowledge that is already out there. So it is easy to see how AI will be very efficient in amassing the knowledge that we already have and bringing it together in very effective ways. It is not clear to me that AI in particular is very capable of revolutionary shifts and paradigmatic shifts as the one that I proposed. So the danger that I would see in AI in that sense is that it would accelerate our ability to replicate what we already have rather than help shift into another way of thinking. I think intrinsically the AI that I know, and it's not enough probably, tends to be conservative in that sense, even though of course very progressive in others. And So the AI that could do what you wanted to do might have to be a very different kind of AI from the AI that we currently have. Beyond that, I don't know. I don't know if AI would be capable of that. I am a little pessimistic about people who say we don't have to solve our problems now. Someone will solve them. The famous, the brilliant person who is born in the future will find out how to get all the CO2 back from the atmosphere, right? Or the AI that we're going to create in the future will come up with the ideas that we don't come up with. It's a little bit the fear that I have is that we're outsourcing a thought process that we ourselves have to do. But it may very well be that AI can be an instrument, a tool towards helping us with that thought process that we have to do. I can't imagine how it would, but I also cannot be sure that it could not. And I would be very glad if it could.
Thank you so much. I would like to end saying that it's our last talk in the series. We had 3 this year, but I do hope we have many more. I cannot think of a better way to finish the year from the USP Winnipeg Talks than to have such a wonderful lecture. Thank you so much for coming, and I would like to ask for a round of applause to our very distinguished guest.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.